The wind howled through the narrow alley, slicing through the night like a knife. Snowflakes swirled in chaotic patterns, landing in uneven piles against the crumbling brick walls. The city had been hit by an early winter storm, the kind that made people retreat into their homes, grateful for warmth and shelter. But here, in the shadows between two buildings, a German shepherd refused to move. Her fur was thick, but it did little against the biting cold. She was curled around something, her body shielding it from the wind. Every so often, she lifted her head to glance around, ears pricked, eyes wary. A tattered old jacket lay beneath her, its edges stiff with ice. Anyone passing by might have assumed she was just another stray, seeking warmth in whatever scraps she could find. But the truth lay beneath that jacket, hidden from the world. Inside the thin folds of fabric, nestled against her belly, were 3 tiny puppies. Their fur was damp from the snow, their bodies trembling as they pressed into their mother for warmth. She nudged them closer, desperate to keep them alive. The street was empty, save for the occasional car in the distance. Hours passed. Her breath came in slow, measured puffs, her body growing stiffer with the cold. Still, she did not move. Then came the sound of footsteps. Nico had been walking home from his shift at the warehouse, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He was exhausted, his boots heavy with slush. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to collapse into bed. But something made him stop. He turned his head toward the alley. A shadow shifted near the wall. At first, he thought it was just another stray dog scavenging, but then he saw her. The German shepherd, curled tightly around something, her eyes locked onto him. She didn't growl, didn't bark, she just watched. Nico hesitated. Strays were common in this part of the city, and most of them were skittish, if not outright aggressive. But there was something different about this one. The way she stayed so still, the way her body curled protectively around that old jacket. He took a step closer. She tensed but didn't flee. Then he saw it, the tiny movement beneath her. His breath caught, puppies. "Jesus," he murmured under his breath. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle her. "Hey, girl, what are you doing out here?" She didn't respond, just tightened her hold on the jacket. Her ribs were visible beneath her fur, her paws raw from the cold. She had been out here for a while. Nico exhaled, his breath forming a cloud in the frozen air. He couldn't just walk away. Not from this. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a half-eaten protein bar. It wasn't much, but it was something. He unwrapped it, breaking off a small piece, and held it out. She eyed it warily, but didn't move. "Come on," he coaxed. "You need to eat." Still, she didn't budge. Her focus remained on her puppies. Nico sighed, glancing up and down the street. No one else was around. No one else was going to help. His apartment wasn't far, but it wasn't exactly pet-friendly. His landlord barely tolerated him, let alone a full-grown dog and 3 newborn puppies. But what choice did he have? The wind picked up again, rattling a loose metal sign down the street. The German shepherd flinched, pressing closer to the tiny bodies beneath her. "All right," Nico muttered. "Let's figure this out." He took off his coat and knelt beside her, draping it carefully over her back. She stiffened but didn't fight him. Slowly, he reached for the jacket beneath her, her muscles coiled, ready to snap at him if necessary. "I just want to help," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I'm not taking them away. I promise." She didn't understand his words, but something in his tone kept her from attacking. Gently, he lifted the edge of the jacket, revealing the tiny, shivering figures underneath. They were so small. Their eyes were barely open, their tiny paws twitching against the cold. They wouldn't survive the night out here. Nico made his decision. Carefully, he gathered the puppies into the jacket, wrapping them securely. The mother tensed, a low whine escaping her throat. "It's okay," he assured her. "You're coming too." She didn't resist when he lifted the bundle. Maybe she was too exhausted. Maybe she knew she had no other choice. The walk back to his apartment was slow. The wind cut through his sweater, but he barely noticed. He kept his arms wrapped tightly around the puppies, feeling their faint warmth through the fabric. The mother walked beside him, her head low, her steps uncertain. By the time they reached his building, his fingers were numb. He fumbled with his keys, pushing the door open and stepping inside. The warmth hit them instantly, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. He set the bundle down gently on the floor. The mother sniffed at her puppies, then curled around them again, her tail wrapping over their tiny bodies. Nico sat back on his heels, running a hand through his damp hair. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. But as he watched the German shepherd settle her head down, her eyes finally blinking with exhaustion, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting them go back out there. The apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock. Nico sat on the floor, legs crossed, watching the mother dog as she curled around her puppies. The warmth of the room had already started to make a difference. Her shivers had lessened, and the puppies, though still weak, weren't trembling as violently. He leaned back against the couch, rubbing his hands together to chase away the lingering cold. The air smelled faintly of damp fur and old wood, a combination that didn't exactly scream home, but right now, comfort wasn't the priority. His stomach twisted with the weight of what he had just done. He hadn't planned for this. Hell, he barely had enough groceries to get himself through the week, and now he was responsible for a starving mother dog and 3 newborns. A deep sigh left him as he pushed himself up, walking toward the kitchen. He rummaged through his cabinets, searching for anything dog-friendly. A half-empty loaf of bread, a can of soup, some rice, nothing that would be of much use. He opened the fridge, eyes scanning over a nearly empty shelf. The only thing remotely useful was a pack of eggs. He cracked 2 into a pan, stirring them over low heat. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When he set the plate down in front of the mother dog, she lifted her head slightly, nostrils flaring, but she didn't move to eat. Her eyes flickered between him and the food, her ears twitching slightly at every sound outside the window. He crouched down, pushing the plate a little closer. "It's for you," he murmured, voice softer than he expected. "You need to eat." Still, she hesitated. The puppies stirred, their tiny bodies shifting against her. One of them let out a faint whimper, and the sound seemed to snap something inside her. She lowered her head and took a tentative bite, then another. Within seconds, the plate was licked clean. He exhaled, relief washing over him. At least she wasn't too far gone to eat. Now came the real problem. Nico pulled out his phone, scrolling through local vet listings. He had no idea the last time she'd seen a doctor, if ever, but judging by the way her ribs jutted out, it had been too long. The puppies, too, needed to be checked. They were small, fragile, and the cold had likely taken a toll on them. After a few minutes of searching, he found a clinic a few blocks away. They opened early. If he could get them there first thing in the morning, maybe they'd stand a chance. He glanced back at the German shepherd. She had settled into a cautious rest, her head resting near her paws, eyes half-lidded but still alert. He ran a hand through his hair. "Guess we should figure out what to call you, huh?" She didn't react, but he hadn't expected her to. His gaze drifted to the puppies, their tiny chests rising and falling. They were so small, so impossibly fragile. He remembered the way she had curled around them in the alley, refusing to move despite the cold, despite her own suffering. Protecting them had been the only thing that mattered to her. His throat felt tight. "Lena," he murmured, testing the name. The dog's ears twitched. He tried again, a little firmer. "Lena." This time her eyes flickered toward him. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. It was enough. The morning came too soon. Nico hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he'd hear the soft whimpers of the puppies, the rustling of Lena shifting, and his mind would jolt awake. By the time the first rays of sun crept through the window, he was already up, pulling on his jacket. Getting them to the vet was going to be a challenge. He didn't have a car, which meant walking. The puppies were too small to be out in the open air, so he carefully bundled them into a towel-lined shoebox. Lena didn't like it, her body tense as she watched, but she didn't interfere. He secured the box under his arm and opened the door. "Come on," he said. Lena hesitated. For a moment, he thought she might refuse. She stood there, muscles locked, nostrils flaring as she took in the unfamiliar hallway. But then she stepped forward, keeping close to his side. The walk to the clinic was slow. Lena stayed glued to him, her ears flicking at every noise. The city was waking up, cars honking, people rushing to work. More than once, Nico caught someone throwing cautious glances in their direction. When they finally reached the clinic, he pushed open the glass door, the bell overhead chiming softly. The receptionist glanced up, her expression shifting immediately when she saw the state of them. "We need help," he said. She nodded, already reaching for a clipboard. "Fill this out, we'll get you back as soon as we can." He took the form, but his focus was on Lena. She stood stiffly beside him, her posture wary. Minutes passed before a vet tech called them back. The exam room was sterile, the scent of antiseptic sharp in the air. Lena didn't like it. She paced, her nails clicking against the tile. The vet, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stepped in. She barely spared Nico a glance before crouching down, her attention solely on Lena. "She's underweight," she murmured. "How long have you had her?" "Just found her last night," Nico admitted. "She was in an alley with them." He gestured to the shoebox. The vet's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let's take a look." She checked the puppies first, her hands gentle as she lifted each one. Their tiny bodies fit easily in her palms. She listened to their breathing, checked their paws, examined their bellies. "They're cold," she said, "but no signs of infection yet. They'll need to be fed regularly, kept warm. No guarantees, but they have a shot." Nico exhaled. Then she turned to Lena. The mother dog stiffened as the vet reached for her, but she didn't lash out. She let the woman check her ribs, her paws, her ears. "She's been through a lot," the vet noted. "Malnourished, probably dehydrated, but no visible wounds." She met Nico's gaze. "You said she was out in the cold all night." He nodded. "She wouldn't have lasted much longer." That hit harder than he expected. The vet straightened. "She needs food, a lot of it, and rest. The puppies need constant warmth and feeding every few hours." Her gaze softened slightly. "You're taking this on." Nico hesitated. He'd been asking himself that same question since last night. But then he looked at Lena, at the way she stood protectively near the shoebox, at the way she had looked at him when he'd said her name. He swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said, "I am." The vet's instructions looped in Nico's head as he stepped back into his apartment, the door clicking shut behind him. Lena padded inside, her movements slower than before, exhaustion weighing her down. The shoebox cradling the puppies was balanced carefully in his arms, the tiny bodies shifting slightly under the blanket as he set them down near the couch. His apartment was small and barely furnished. A single couch, a coffee table, and a mattress on the floor in the next room. Not exactly the best place to raise a litter of puppies, but it would have to do. Lena sniffed the air, hesitant but not fearful. She moved straight to the puppies, nudging them with the tip of her nose, settling herself beside them. Nico exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't planned on this. He hadn't planned on any of it. And yet, here they were. He grabbed his phone, typing in a search for emergency supplies. The vet had said the puppies needed to be kept warm, fed regularly, and watched closely. He had no idea where to start, but that didn't mean he wouldn't figure it out. After a few minutes, he found a pet store a few blocks away that carried milk replacer and bottles for newborn puppies. He glanced at Lena, still curled protectively around them. He couldn't take them with him, not in this cold. He crouched down, meeting her wary gaze. "I'll be back," he murmured. She didn't react, just rested her head on her paws, eyes flickering closed. He grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the cold. The pet store was small, packed with shelves of kibble, toys, and supplies he had never needed before. He scanned the aisles, spotting the formula the vet had mentioned. He grabbed a bottle set too, along with the cheapest bag of dog food he could find. His savings were already tight, and this wasn't going to make things easier. At the register, the cashier, an older woman with tired eyes, scanned the items without comment until she reached the puppy milk replacer. "You've got newborns?" she asked, glancing up. Nico nodded. "Found them last night, stray mother." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but there was something softer in her expression now. "They'll need round-the-clock care," she warned. "Every few hours at least." "I know." She hesitated, then reached under the counter, pulling out a small fleece blanket. "Take this," she said, sliding it across to him. "Keep them warm." He blinked, caught off guard. "I can't afford." "It's free." Something in her tone told him arguing would be pointless. He nodded, mumbling a quick thanks before gathering the bags and heading back into the cold. Lena lifted her head the moment the door opened. Her ears twitched, but she didn't move from her spot beside the puppies. Nico set the bags down, pulling out the blanket first. He unraveled it, laying it beside her. "For them," he said. She eyed it, then, after a beat, nudged one of the puppies closer onto the soft fabric. He pulled out the formula next, reading the instructions carefully. Warm water, mix thoroughly, test the temperature. He followed each step, trying not to second-guess himself. When the bottle was ready, he hesitated. The puppies were so small, he wasn't sure how to do this without hurting them. Lena watched as he picked up one of the pups, cradling it carefully in his palm. The tiny body squirmed, mouth opening and closing blindly. He placed the nipple of the bottle near its mouth, waiting. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the pup latched on, weak but determined. Relief flooded him. He kept the bottle steady, watching as the pup drank in slow, careful pulls. When it finally stopped, he set it down gently, repeating the process with the others. Lena didn't interfere, but her eyes never left him. Once they were fed, Nico leaned back against the couch, rubbing his tired eyes. He'd have to do this again in a few hours, and again after that. He glanced at Lena. "You're not making this easy, you know." She blinked at him. He sighed. "You need a name." She tilted her head slightly, just a fraction, but it was the first time he'd seen her react to something he said. "Lena," he tried. Her ears twitched, not a rejection. "Lena," he repeated, firmer this time. She didn't look away. "Yeah, that fit." He let out a breath, leaning his head back against the couch. He had no idea what he was doing, no idea how he was going to manage this. But as he glanced down at the small, fragile lives now depending on him, he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let them down. The first night passed in a haze of exhaustion. Nico had never thought so much about time before, how the hours stretched unbearably thin when you had to wake up every couple of them just to make sure something so small, so impossibly fragile, was still breathing. The puppies stirred and whimpered in the dark, and each time he forced himself up, groggy and stiff, to warm the formula and make sure they fed. By the time morning light seeped through the curtains, his body ached. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time, and the weight of it clung to him, thick and heavy. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional shift of Lena adjusting her position. She watched him each time he moved, her gaze steady, unreadable. He sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing his face with both hands. His arms felt weak, his head heavy. He needed coffee, food, something to pull him out of the fog. But before he could force himself to move, there was a knock at the door. His shoulders tensed. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a second, his mind raced through worst-case scenarios: the landlord, a complaint, someone coming to tell him he couldn't have dogs here. He pushed himself up, dragging his feet toward the door. When he cracked it open, he found himself staring at his neighbor, Camilla. She was wrapped in a thick coat, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her eyes flickered over him, taking in his disheveled state. She frowned. "You look like hell." He sighed, pulling the door open a little wider. "Yes, well, long night." Her gaze dipped past him into the apartment where Lena was still curled around the puppies. Her expression shifted, curiosity flaring. "You got a dog." "Not exactly by choice." She arched an eyebrow. "You steal it." He shook his head and stepped back, letting her inside. She didn't hesitate, walking in and crouching near Lena, keeping a respectful distance. "Where'd she come from?" "Found her in an alley. She had the puppies with her." Camilla's expression softened. "Jesus." She glanced over her shoulder at him. "You're taking care of them." He shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. "Trying." She studied him for a long moment. "You have any idea what you're doing?" "Not really." A small, amused huff left her. "Figures." He didn't argue. Instead, he sank onto the couch, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Vet said they need round-the-clock care, feeding every couple hours, keeping them warm, just trying to keep them alive at this point." Camilla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You got supplies?" "Some." She hummed, glancing at Lena again. "She trust you yet?" "Getting there." Camilla reached out slowly, palm up, letting Lena sniff her hand. The shepherd hesitated, then gave a brief, cautious sniff before settling back down. "She's a good mom," Camilla murmured. Nico exhaled, leaning his head back against the couch. "Yeah." There was a pause, then the rustle of fabric as Camilla stood. "You eaten?" He blinked up at her. "What?" She crossed her arms. "Have you eaten?" He hesitated, then shook his head. Camilla sighed. "I'll be back." Before he could argue, she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. When she returned 20 minutes later, she held a plastic bag in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. She shoved the coffee into his hands before he could protest and dropped the bag onto the table. "Egg sandwich," she said. "Eat." He didn't argue. He was too tired to. The first bite was warm, soft, and heavier than he expected. His stomach clenched around it, reminding him just how long it had been since he'd eaten anything solid. Camilla sat on the arm of the couch, watching him. "So what's the plan?" He swallowed, chasing the bite with a sip of coffee. "Plan." "For them," she nodded toward Lena and the puppies. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "I don't know, just trying to get through one day at a time." Camilla tilted her head. "You gonna keep them?" The question made his chest tighten. He hadn't let himself think that far ahead. "I don't know." She studied him, then Lena. "She's attached to you." He glanced at the shepherd. She wasn't pressed against him, wasn't curled at his feet, but she was watching. Always watching. He exhaled. "Yeah." Camilla nodded like she understood something he didn't. "Well," she said, pushing herself up, "you're not doing this alone." He blinked. "What?" She smirked. "You think I'm gonna let you screw this up?" Something in his chest eased, just a little. Maybe he wasn't alone in this after all. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly the apartment became something more than just a place to sleep. It became a home. Not just for Nico, but for Lena and the puppies too. The puppies grew stronger with each passing day. Their once fragile bodies filled out, their fur thickened, and their eyes, which had barely been open at first, now tracked movement with curiosity. One of them, a little female with a streak of darker fur down her back, had started exploring first, stumbling over her own paws as she ventured beyond the blanket. The others followed soon after, their tiny tails wagging uncertainly as they tumbled over each other. Lena had changed too. At first, she had been cautious, always watching, always waiting. But now, she no longer flinched at sudden movements. She no longer hesitated before eating the food he set down for her. And sometimes, when Nico sat on the floor, she would come to him on her own, resting her head against his knee for just a moment before returning to her puppies. Trust, it had taken time, patience, quiet moments where he let her come to her own conclusions. But it was there now, unspoken but real. Camilla had become a regular presence, stopping by with spare blankets, extra food, and an endless supply of unsolicited advice. Not that he minded. She had a way of stepping in without making it seem like charity, and when she teased him about the way Lena had taken to following him from room to room, he found he didn't even bother to argue. But as much as things had settled into a routine, Nico knew it couldn't last forever. The puppies were growing fast. Soon, they would need more space, more attention than he could realistically give them. And Lena, she deserved more than just a cramped apartment and a guy who was figuring things out as he went. That thought sat heavy in his chest as he watched the puppies wrestle one evening. Lena lay nearby, her eyes half closed, content, but still aware of their every movement. Nico leaned against the couch, his fingers absently tapping against his knee. The idea of letting them go didn't sit right with him, but he knew he had to start thinking about it. The first step was the vet, again. This time, the visit was different. The puppies were no longer weak, no longer just barely clinging to life. They squirmed in his arms, yipping at the unfamiliar smells of the clinic as he carried them inside. Lena walked beside him, her head high, her movements confident in a way they hadn't been before. The vet was pleased. The puppies were healthy, growing exactly as they should. "That's a good mother right there," the vet said, scratching behind Lena's ear. Nico nodded, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the carrier. "Yeah, she is." And that was when the conversation shifted. Rehoming, adoption. Options. The clinic had connections, people who specialized in finding good homes for dogs like Lena and her puppies. People who would make sure they were safe, loved, and cared for. He listened, nodding in all the right places, but something inside him twisted painfully at the thought of handing them over. By the time he got back to the apartment, Camilla was already there, seated on the floor with the puppies crawling over her lap. She took one look at his face and sighed. "You talked to the vet," she guessed. Nico tossed his keys onto the counter. "Yeah. And they have places that can take them, good places." Camilla studied him, but he exhaled sharply. "I don't know if I can do it." She was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "You wanted to make sure they were safe. That's what you've been saying this whole time." "I know. And now they have a chance at that." "I know." Camilla leaned back, resting her elbows on the floor. "So what's the problem?" He raked a hand through his hair, staring at Lena. She was lying near the couch, watching the puppies, but when he spoke, her ears twitched. She knew. Somehow, she knew. "What if she doesn't want to go?" Camilla didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted, reaching out to scratch behind Lena's ears. The shepherd leaned into the touch, just slightly. "You should let her decide," Camilla finally said. And that was exactly what he did. The adoption process took time. Potential homes were screened, interviews conducted. The puppies were the easiest. There were more families wanting them than there were puppies to give. One by one, they left, going to new homes, new lives. Nico told himself it was the right thing, and it was. But that didn't make it any easier when his apartment felt quieter without them. And then there was Lena. She had been watching. Every time one of her puppies left, she had watched, but she hadn't panicked. She hadn't searched. She had simply looked at him, waiting. Waiting for what, he wasn't sure. Until the day came when he had to make a choice. The last of the puppies had been adopted, and now it was just Lena. A family had been interested in her. A good family. A couple with a house, space to run, experience with rescue dogs. It was everything she deserved. So why did it feel like he was making a mistake? The day before she was supposed to go, he found himself sitting on the floor beside her, his fingers absent-mindedly running through her fur. She didn't move away. "You'd be happy there," he murmured. Lena didn't respond, obviously. But when he shifted, when he pulled his hand away, she did something she had never done before. She leaned into him. Just slightly, just enough. And that was it. That was the moment he knew. The next morning, when the new family arrived, Nico was waiting for them at the door. And Lena was sitting at his side. The couple smiled, stepping forward, reaching out cautiously. Lena sniffed their hands, polite, curious, but when they tried to coax her forward, she didn't move. She stayed right where she was. Nico swallowed hard, his hand resting lightly on her back. "She's not going anywhere," he said. The couple hesitated, then nodded in understanding. And just like that, it was decided. Lena was home. For good. The apartment felt different now. Quieter in a way that wasn't empty. The absence of the puppies had left a space, but it wasn't a hollow one. It had been filled with something else, something steady, something certain. Lena had settled into the rhythm of their life together without hesitation. She no longer paced near the door or searched for something missing. She no longer hovered with uncertainty. She moved with quiet confidence, as if she had always belonged there. Nico noticed the shift in small ways. The way she stretched out across the floor rather than keeping herself curled tight. The way she met his eyes without the flicker of wariness that had once been there. The way she waited for him, always aware of where he was, but not as if she expected him to leave, just as if she expected him to stay. She had chosen this. And he had chosen her. The first real test of that came one evening when he stepped outside to grab the mail. It was barely a 30-second trip, but when he returned, Lena was standing near the door, ears up, posture alert. She didn't panic, didn't whine, but she had noticed his absence. That night, when he sat on the couch, she settled near him rather than across the room. Close enough to touch, though she didn't press against him, just near. It was a quiet reassurance that neither of them needed to say out loud. Camilla noticed the change, too. When she stopped by, she didn't comment on it directly, but her gaze lingered on Lena, observing the way she had relaxed into her new life. She had made herself at home. And so Nico adjusted. The space beside his bed became hers, a folded blanket that she returned to each night. He learned the signs of when she was hungry before she even went to her bowl. He recognized the way she moved when she was restless, the way she watched the door when she was waiting for him to return. Routine formed without effort. Mornings started with quiet walks, the city waking around them as they moved through the streets. Lena kept close at his side, her pace even, her head held high. She no longer flinched at passing cars or sudden noises. It was as if she had decided this was hers now, too. The first time he left her alone for a few hours, he returned with the slightest hesitation, unsure of what he would find. Nothing had changed. She was there, waiting, but not with desperation, just awareness. She had known he would come back. That trust settled deep, something unspoken but understood. Winter faded into something softer, the cold loosening its grip on the city. The streets lost their frost, and the air shifted, no longer biting but crisp. One evening, as they walked, Lena stopped near the entrance of a park. She had never pulled toward it before, but this time, she hesitated, glancing up at him. He followed her gaze, then nodded. They stepped onto the grass, moving through the open space at a steady pace. It wasn't crowded, just a few scattered people, the distant sound of conversation blending with the rustling of leaves. Lena's steps lightened. For the first time, she moved with something close to ease. She had spent so much time surviving. Now, she was learning something else. And Nico, without realizing it, was learning the same. He had never thought much about what it meant to have something constant, something unwavering. But as Lena moved beside him, her presence as sure as the ground beneath his feet, he understood it. This was what it meant to belong.